his ability to be in, land, and then be out before someone can effectively counter. That is going to be huge in this fight. Hello, everybody, and welcome to One-on-One. Today, I want to go over a preview for UFC 273 coming up this weekend in Jacksonville, Florida. I will be there, and I'm so excited to be there because we've got two titles on the line. Of course, featherweight king Alexander Volkanovski will be defending against the Korean Zombie, and in the bantamweight division, the long-awaited rematch between Aljamain Sterling and Petr Yan, champ versus interim champ. A lot to be settled there. But first, let's talk about this main event, because this is actually, it's a better fight than I think people are giving it credit for. Certainly better than what the odds makers are making it out to be, because last time I checked, Alexander Volkanovski was like -7 something, -750. And listen, while I think he has every right and should be favored in this fight, this is MMA. And we're talking about the Korean Zombie. So, buckle up with me here for a second. Let's run through some things I want to talk about, and I'll make a case for why I feel like those odds, at least, are a little bit disrespectful of one Korean Zombie. So to dive in, taking a look at Alexander Volkanovski. Actually, you know what? Let's do this. Let's take a look at the stats first, right off the top, to just kind of set the stage here. So we have Alexander Volkanovski, 23-1 overall. The Korean Zombie, 17-6. But most importantly, I like to take a look at the UFC record. And for Volkanovski, that is 10-0, which is ridiculous. And Korean Zombie, 7-3, an excellent record, to be honest. Not much difference in height, not a lot of difference in reach. They're both listed as orthodox, although that's kind of a lie because they both change stances quite a bit. The interesting thing comes when you start to look at the stats in terms of striking. I think that the stats here tell a very interesting story. So let's take a look. In terms of striking accuracy, and this is a big one here because Alexander Volkanovski is a very high volume, in your face, pressure type of striker. But the fact that the man can have the type of accuracy that he does in addition to that volume is just, it's tremendous. He has a 56.8% striking accuracy rate, whereas Zombie is just 42.7%. And then, as I alluded to a second ago, not only is it that he's accurate, it's that he is landing a very, very high pace. So Volkanovski, 6.42 strikes per minute, which is crazy, to a Zombie's 3.89. They both have very high defense, although Volkanovski's is higher at 60.7%. Both decent amounts absorbed per minute. And then you get into some of these grappling statistics. The takedown accuracy, not overly high for either, but they're both generally speaking strikers. I know Zombie is also well known for his ground game, but in general, these guys like to bang it out on the feet. And then in terms of takedown defense, this is another one that jumps off the page, with Alexander Volkanovski having a 70.4% takedown defense. But even better than that, the Zombie is at 76.5% takedown defense. So I think that tells us a lot about the tools that these guys are coming into in terms of this fight. Now, for Alexander Volkanovski, the thing that jumps off the page whenever you watch him fight is, of course, his striking. He has a very unique style. And it's not that he does anything ridiculously flashy. It's genuinely how perfect he is at doing the things that he does do. When you talk about a guy who has a pressure game, sometimes people will pressure with presence. Sometimes people will pressure with the threat of the takedown. Sometimes people will pressure with volume, or with power. There's different ways to pressure your opponent. Alexander Volkanovski is interesting in that he can do and does do all of the above. He has a very in-your-face style of striking where he likes to kind of make sure that his opponent has their heel, against the back of the cage, and he's limiting their options, not allowing them to get into their game, to get into their rhythm, and really forcing them to have to make decisions based on what he is doing. And what allows him to be so effective in delivering that pressure, if you peel away, a layer of thinking here, okay, well, what allows him to be successful in that pressure? And to me, it's his footwork. I think, footwork is the basis for everything in striking and a lot of grappling too, in terms of defending takedowns or getting takedowns. But we're talking about the striking right now. His ability to keep his feet in a correct position at all times is really, really tremendous. He's never out of position. He's never out of balance. And so what he does is he forces his opponents to constantly be thinking about what he's doing. And another way that he does that is by using a lot, and I mean a lot, of feints. That's a huge cornerstone of his striking game. When you go back and watch the first minute or two, honestly, he does it throughout the fights, but I always notice it the most at the beginning of rounds, or certainly the beginning of fights. His movement is so, you would be tempted to say erratic, but erratic kind of makes it sound like it's not purposeful. It is purposeful. By feinting, feinting is a skill set in and of itself, and it's one that Alexander Volkanovski and others as well, Israel Adesanya, we talk a lot about his feints as well, and we should. It's a unique skill set, and it's not just about making herky-jerky movements. There's a lot of strategy involved in how and when and how often you feint. And then on top of that, a fighter has to have the cardio to be able to support that level of feinting. Because I tell you what, it's one thing to be an ultra smooth striker and to not have a lot of movement and to maintain that throughout a fight, but to be the type of fighter that Alexander Volkanovski is, to be constantly moving in and out of range, cutting angles, switching stances, and feinting as you're doing all of those things, the cardio base that you have to be able to support that is just tremendous. But he has it. So when you watch him in fights like against Brian Ortega, where you can just see the look on Brian Ortega's face at times, he can't get a read on what Alexander Volkanovski is going to do, because he's constantly moving in and out. And not only does he feint in terms of like, oh, I'm going to throw a jab, oh, I'm going to throw a right hand, he's constantly feinting a level change. And because he is so powerful and so good at closing the distance lightning fast, his opponents have to take those feints, those threats very, very seriously. So when you think about, putting yourself in the shoes of a Brian Ortega, or in this case, a Korean Zombie, you're getting 10, 12, 15 different looks at the same time. He's over here, he's over there, he's feinting this, he's level changing. And not only does it cause the opponents a lot of times to freeze up to some degree, it taxes the nervous system of the opponent. I think I've talked about this before in other videos. If I haven't, I know I've said it somewhere. But when you think about like when you do that slap game with your friends where you slap each other's hands and you have to jerk out of the way, think about doing that for like a half an hour straight, and involving your legs and involving your hip feints. It's absolutely exhausting, not just physically, but on your brain, because every time you go to react, it's like this teeny tiny little adrenaline dump that your body is constantly just squirting out enough gasoline, like, oh, we might have to go here. Oh, we might have to go here. So when Alexander Volkanovski fights, not only is he presenting a lot of different looks because he's switching stances, he's causing, his opponent's brain to be overloaded, overstimulated with all sorts of information, where in training, you're typically not going to find someone, you get kind of used to your training partners, you get used to how they move, and then you get presented with someone like Alexander Volkanovski, and it can be absolutely overwhelming and exhausting. And that's a huge part of his approach to striking. As I said, his management of distance, his ability to be in, land, and then be out before someone can effectively counter. That is going to be huge in this fight, because as we know, Zombie, that's what he looks to do. He's looking to land those heavy, heavy counter shots. But for Volkanovski, he's so good at not just fighting forward, but fighting backward, that I think it's going to be very interesting to see if Zombie is able to find Alexander Volkanovski to land those counters. And I'm thinking perhaps not, because Alexander Volkanovski is so adept at moving backwards and moving in, and not just moving backwards, but angling out and finding ways to be out of range after landing an effective combination of his own. as I mentioned before, another part of his game is the fact that he's never out of position. He Because he constantly keeps himself centered over his hips, over his body. When we talk about not being out of position, it's both in terms of like distance between yourself and your opponent, but it's also kind of like your body mechanics, where you are. You know, Izzy's unique because he can be out of position and still knock people out. That's what, makes him so fascinating. I remember talking about that when we did the breakdown of his last fight. But for Volkanovski, he just never puts himself in those spots. He's constantly correctly over his center of gravity for whatever it is that he's doing. Now, because of that, because he's not ever out of position, because he's never putting himself out of position, it's part and parcel with he's never really loading up on shots. So we don't think of Alexander Volkanovski as being an overly powerful striker, although he hits plenty hard, plenty hard. It's not like he's just a touch fighter either. He kind of falls in that in-between game, but it's because he's so fundamentally sound. He's never winding up. He's not ever looking to just completely go out there and take someone's head off. He's got enough power where if it connects, he's going to put someone out, but not so much so that he's opening himself up for opportunities for his opponent to take advantage of. And then it kicks. You got to talk about the kicks of Alexander Volkanovski as well. Because he's almost always the shorter fighter, and because he likes to fight at range, and before he starts to really put together his pressure game, a lot of times he stays on the outside, kind of making reads on his opponent early in fights. While he's making reads and while he's feinting, he's also landing a lot of leg kicks. And I mean a lot. Between leg kicks and calf kicks, he stays extremely busy from the outside, and he could do a lot of damage there. When you go back and look at the two Max Holloway fights, the leg kicks were a huge factor. In fact, the first time that they fought, Alexander Volkanovski landed 75 leg kicks on Max Holloway. It's a record for the featherweight division. But what's even crazier is that the second time they fought, he landed 67 of them. And that is the second most leg kicks landed in a featherweight fight. So he's got the record for the most, and he's got the record for the second most. And both of them are against one of the greatest featherweights in the history of the UFC. So the leg kicks are a huge part of Volkanovski's game. We also saw that in the Brian Ortega fight. He was targeting that leg quite a bit early. However, the one big opportunity that Brian Ortega had in that fight was when he caught a kick of Alexander Volkanovski and landed a punch off of catching the kick. And that's when we saw Alexander Volkanovski get knocked down and Brian Ortega immediately jump on that mounted guillotine that was so deep. It's absolutely unbelievable to me that he was able to survive that takedown attempt. I wanted to go back, and I think it was 19 seconds that Alexander Volkanovski was caught in a full-on mounted guillotine choke from one of the best jiu-jitsu players in the UFC, in Brian Ortega. Absolutely crazy that he was able to stay in that fight and to defend it and to get out of it, and then to go on to do, what he did to Brian Ortega, which was, for the large part, I mean, it was a great fight. But by and large, that was a showcase for Alexander Volkanovski. The confidence that you would have from surviving a submission attempt like that against one of the best jiu-jitsu players in the UFC, in Brian Ortega, absolutely is a huge, it's a bonus for him coming into this fight against an excellent grappler in Korean Zombie. But to me, I think that this fight in many ways is going to come down to the ability that Alexander Volkanovski has to put people on the back foot and to inflict far more damage on them than they do on him, even against some of the busiest fighters that we've seen him face. People like Max Holloway, huge volume striker. And Volkanovski was able to out-volume a volume guy like him. He has the biggest strike differential in the history of the featherweight division at plus 2.88 significant strikes per minute. So that means he is landing almost 3 significant strikes per minute more than his adversaries. And like I said, we're talking about guys who stay very busy, guys like Max, guys like Brian Ortega. Incredible for him to be able to deliver that type of volume. And I think that that's going to be a very big factor in this fight. Before I move on to Zombie, I think one thing that has to be talked about is the mentality of Alexander Volkanovski coming into this fight in particular. If you've watched any of his interviews this week, I think it's been very interesting to see that, this is his fight to win in his mind, in everybody's mind, clearly in the odds maker's mind. I haven't come across many people who are picking Korean Zombie to win. And that's absolutely no disrespect to him. I think it's a nod to the greatness of Alexander Volkanovski. But you hear him this week talking a lot about the freedom he feels in this fight, not only because he's made some really conscious decision to quit caring about what other people think. There's so many people that don't really back him because they're such huge fans of Max that you go out there and you beat Max twice and it's sort of kind of controversial. There's a lot of haters, a lot of Volkanovski haters, and I think they're pretty vocal on social media. He finally has figured out and found a way to bottle that up and just put it out of the equation, not allow any of that chatter to enter his mind. And then on top of that, I think because he feels like he is so far heads, shoulders, probably waist as well above Korean Zombie, he's looking for a finish in this fight. He has flat out said it many, many times. So I think in this fight that we are going to see a different Alexander Volkanovski. I think we're going to see a guy who maybe is loading up on his punches a little bit more, who maybe is out of position a little bit more than he might normally be, because I think he's going to allow himself to be a little bit more loose so that he can just go out there and have a fight where he can find a finish. Interestingly, I think it's going to make for a really, really fun fight, but that shift in mentality could be, I'm not saying it will be, could be the opening that Korean Zombie needs to take advantage of that. So with that, let's transition to talking about him. So Korean Zombie, number 4 ranked featherweight in the UFC and an absolute legend. I mean, the guy's been fighting in the UFC since 2011. And anybody who's been a fan for a while, how can you not be a fan of the Korean Zombie? When he burst onto the scene 2011, getting that insane twister finish against Leonard Garcia, the first one we'd ever seen in the UFC. Of course, Bryce Mitchell got the second one, but just an absolutely wild thing to have happen. I think that really opened people's eyes to, man, this guy's absolutely crazy. But anybody who watched the WEC before he made it to the UFC, I think kind of already knew that. He's got this style that very much gave him the nickname Zombie, where he is so offensively minded that he does kind of zombie forward and take quite a bit of damage. I think, though, that we're going to see a pretty big evolution from Korean Zombie when we've already started to see it. So I'll get to that in a second. But this is a fight where I think we might see a thinking zombie. When we imagine zombies, we think of them as these, like mindless monsters that just only move in one direction and have no thought in their head about what they're doing. They're just mindlessly walking forward, and their ability to take damage and just continue to move forward. That all remains true. The man can take a punch. That has not changed. But I think that the Zombie is introducing a lot more thought and a lot more calculation into his game as of late. This will actually be his second title shot. First one came way back in 2013 against Jose Aldo, did not get the desired result. He wasn't overly happy with his performance. If I remember right, it was kind of a last minute situation for him. So this is very much a new opportunity for Chan Sung Jung, the Korean Zombie, to take an opportunity to snatch the belt. And for someone who has been fighting as long as he has, to have a second chance at fighting for a title so long after the first chance, it's pretty incredible. And I think it speaks a little bit, to be honest, to his inactivity. He just hasn't had the opportunity for a variety of reasons between that gap to have the volume of fights that we would expect from most fighters. But I think more than anything, it speaks to his ability to keep up with the game. And I think that that's now more true than ever in the last couple of years. So the style that we always talk about with Korean Zombie is, like I said, it's this offense above everything else mentality. And, it's an interesting thing because when you have the type of chin that he has and you're afforded that luxury of not worrying about every single strike that your opponent is going to land, your lack of defense almost becomes a form of offense in and of itself. I mean, I'm not saying that very articulately right now, so I'll try to word it a little bit better. But what I mean by that is when you are less concerned than most about getting hit, you're willing to take risks that most fighters would not be willing to take, and that your opponent is probably not used to seeing in fights. So I think, Zombie is not just a tricky look for people because, he's hard to put away. It's so much deeper than that. The fact that he's hard to put away also puts him in a position to inflict damage himself more often than most fighters would be in that position, because they would be thinking about defense. And he's just simply, it's not that he's not defensively sound. He does move his head. He does move out of the way. It's just that offense takes a much, much higher priority than defense does. So for him, he's constantly thinking about, where do I need to be to land a strike on my opponent? Less about, okay, where is my opponent's strike coming from? That could potentially be a downfall in this fight and I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing Alexander Volkanovski with so much confidence coming into this fight, right? Because he is so calculated and so precision and so perfect when he strikes that I think for him, he's like, oh man, this is going to be a buffet. And what I'm trying to say, not very articulately right now, is that I don't think it's going to be that easy. I think that Korean Zombie's style of taking one to give one, sometimes taking two to give one, can actually be something that will work in his favor in this matchup, because he's going to be in the pocket with Alexander Volkanovski. And if Alexander Volkanovski is entering the pocket with too much freedom, he keeps talking about freedom, too much freedom, we could potentially see Zombie catch him. And those are the opportunities where we've seen Zombie shine many times before. Hanato Moicano, when he knocked out Hanato Moicano, I mean, absolutely not just incredible power on display, but excellent thinking on display. His ability to counter Moicano in that moment, I think, is a really good example of, he wasn't thinking about, where do I block Moicano's shot? He was thinking about, how do I hit Moicano in this moment? Another example of finding an opportunity like that, the Dennis Bermudez knockout. I mean, there's no doubt that Korean Zombie has phenomenal power in his hands, and his willingness to stay focused on his offense in the pocket has led to some of his best finishes. One thing about his striking style, though, that does concern me in this fight is how heavy he is on that lead leg. I mean, you can see it right out the gate in some of his fights. He almost like leaves his face out there, leaves his lead hand pretty low, and stays very heavy on that lead leg, because he's trying to pull out the offense of his opponent so that he can counter, because that's where some of his best moves are. The best aspect of his game is his ability to counter. I just wonder if Alexander Volkanovski's range manipulation and feinting will make that a really difficult part of Zombie's game for him to put into play, because when you're lead leg heavy and your lead hand is low and you're sort of manipulating range by making it appear that you're closer to the yard, like the fighters that kind of put their head out there like that, part of that is so that you can pull and then return a combination more easily without having to shuffle your feet and lose time in doing that. But Volkanovski being so explosive and so effective with his feints, I just don't know if Zombie is going to be able to fight the way that he's used to fighting, in terms of being lead leg heavy and manipulating the space simply by moving his head and his upper body back and forth. Another aspect of Korean Zombie's offense that I think could be very effective in this fight is his low kick. He has a nasty calf kick, We saw that in his fight with Dan Ige, which I think was probably one of the better examples of the evolution that we're starting to see from the Korean Zombie. Less of a brawler, more of a thinker. And while the fans of Korean Zombie may not like hearing that, because we love, I mean, me included, right? We love a good fight. We love a good brawl. For him to go out there and just be a little bit more calculated, I think he's going to continue to find more and more success. And when you go back and you watch the Dan Ige fight, I mean, that's what you see is a thinking Korean Zombie who was attacking the leg, who was wrestling effectively. In fact, I mean, one thing I haven't even brought up yet is the wrestling of Zombie. It's not something that we talk about a lot with him. It's always the submission game and the striking. Now, we talk a lot about the takedown defense of the Korean Zombie, which is excellent. When I read the stat off the top there, it's phenomenal. But more recently, he's becoming an offensive threat as well. And we really saw that in the Dan Ige fight. I mean, he was 3 of 5 on his takedown attempts. So good percentage there. Dan Ige was 0 for 4. So the defense held up for Zombie. But with him landing 3 of 5 takedowns, it added up to 10 minutes of control time for Korean Zombie in that fight. And Dan Ige is an excellent wrestler, a really, really good wrestler. So for Zombie to go in there and not just have the defense be on point, but to start to have more of an offensive wrestling game, highly effective for him in that fight. And even if he doesn't necessarily go out there and ragdoll Alexander Volkanovski, if Zombie can present the threat of a takedown, that's just one more opportunity for him to draw out the counters, draw out the offense of Volkanovski and land the counters that he's looking to land. I do think that the evolution of the Korean Zombie is an important piece here. Not only did we see it in the Dan Ige fight, he's been at Fight Ready for a little while now, and that camp, I tell you what, is probably, I think, one of the best growing camps that we have right now. And by and large, I think it's partly because they have such a phenomenal coaching staff that really focuses on very, very specific fight prep. From what I've heard from the fighters down there, you know, the men and women that train there, it's not just about showing up to practice and getting a good sweat and putting in the work. Those are all important things. But what you hear coming out of that camp is that they literally tailor the camps for, in particular, their UFC fighters. So you got to believe that, you know, Eddie Cha, Santino DeFranco, Henry Cejudo, the rest of the coaching staff there, I'm sure I'm missing some people, are sitting down and they're watching film with a laser focus on the openings that Alexander Volkanovski presents. Now, that's a tough task because the fact is the man has not lost in the UFC, and the one loss he does have was at welterweight, and we basically should throw that out the window. He may as well be undefeated. So, and not a lot of footage of him in a great deal of trouble either. So a tall task, but I do think that the experience, the evolution, and the mindset, the new mindset of the Korean Zombie could create a closer fight than the odds makers are making it seem like. So I think it's going to be a really good one. I think that it's going to come down to the answer to a few questions is going to be what this fight comes down to. Who will be on the back foot more? Because both of these guys like to put their opponent on the back foot. Who will be more consistent and effective in landing the calf kick and the leg kicks? And will the combination of a slightly more risky Volkanovski and a slightly more calculated Zombie make this fight closer than I think a lot of us are thinking it might be? We shall see. Only the fight can bear that one out. And moving on to the co-main event, man, this is such an interesting one because not often do you have a rematch that is not because the first fight was super close. This rematch, of course, is taking place because the first one ended in a win for Aljamain Sterling off of an illegal strike from Petr Yan. So I think the best way to dissect how this next fight might play out is certainly to take a look at how the first fight was playing out before it ended so unceremoniously. So this fight took place a year and a month ago. And it was in the UFC Apex, so not a crowd for that one. We'll have a crowd this time, of course, in Jacksonville. And when you talk about the fight, everyone, I think, I don't know, I think it's colored in a lot of people's minds a certain way simply because of how it ended. And you really have to go back and try to watch it with a fresh pair of eyes, and not allow the things that transpired after the fight to change how you view the fight happening in the first place. I say that because the first fight, or excuse me, the first round, Aljamain Sterling was having a lot of success. And I think you could argue that he won the first round. I don't know that you could say it definitively, but I wouldn't, be mad at some scorecards that had Aljamain Sterling winning the first round. Certainly the first couple minutes of the first round looked very good for Aljamain Sterling. The amount of pressure and volume, I mean, he was getting right in Petr Yan's face, but at the same time, not allowing Yan into the range where he likes to fight, which of course is that boxing range. Sterling was using side kicks. He was flicking the jab out there. He was constantly, changing stances. He was using front kicks. And if he could have kept that up, I think we could have seen a potentially different fight, because to be honest with you, for the first roughly 3 minutes, Petr Yan doesn't do a whole lot other than do what Petr Yan always does, which is have a very high educated guard and do, the minimal amount that he needed to while he was watching Aljamain Sterling work furiously. Petr Yan is sitting there behind that guard, making reads the entire time. Okay, this is how he approaches for a takedown. Okay, all right. When he throws a side kick, he kind of sets it up and his hips look like this. As he's, that's the conversation that Petr Yan is having the entire time. However, while Yan is having that conversation in his mind, making those reads, Aljamain Sterling was definitely racking up points and certainly racking up momentum early in that round. However, as I think often happens in Petr Yan fights, there's like a moment where you see him go, all right, I've had enough. And he starts to click in. And it came in the first round in this fight, the first moment where you see things kind of start to shift in Jan's favor, was about the 3-minute mark. And he lands a beautiful shot and knocks Aljamain down. And I think it did two things. First off, from that moment on, you can see Aljamain Sterling's gas continue to deplete. Not only because he was continuing to fight at such a frenetic pace, but also because when you take damage like that, I think sometimes people don't realize how much getting knocked down affects your gas tank. When your mind is not firing at the same level that it was a second ago with your body, it's exhausting for your mind. And there's such an adrenaline dump that happens when you're hurt, that recovering from being hurt isn't just about shaking the fog out. There's a real physical taxation that takes place as you're attempting to recover from a big shot. So from that moment on, we saw Sterling, continue. He was trying to implement the game plan, which was clearly wrestle a lot and stay right in his face and bully the bully, which that's a great game plan against someone like Petr Yan, to bully the bully. That's oftentimes that's what you have to do to these guys who put everyone else on the back foot. But the problem was Petr Yan is so defensively sound when he fights that when, in this instance, as Aljamain was trying to bully the bully, he was just exhausting himself, because Yan, as I said before, he keeps such a tight, I've got a hat on, so it's kind of goofy, but he's got such a high guard and he just stays right here. And he fires shots from right here, and he moves and he moves and he just marches forward, doesn't kick a ton, but man, is his boxing good. It is so incredibly good. Not only that, the defense, his takedown defense against Aljamain Sterling was another factor that completely, it just wiped Aljamain out in this fight. I looked it up and I'm going to go, let's see here. Yeah. So in the fight, Yan was 7 for 7 on his takedowns, and Aljo was 1 of 17. And I see a lot of people talking about how they expect a much heavier wrestling approach from Aljamain Sterling in this fight. I don't know, man. I don't know. To be one of 17 the first time around. Now, early in the fight, yes, I can see him doing that. But Aljamain Sterling has got to find a way to focus on efficiency this time around. And to me, that's not just shotgun spraying takedown attempts. Because when you go back to that third round, especially the fourth round, he was so exhausted that things were being telegraphed and things were getting loose and he was losing his balance. And to be honest with you, I'm surprised that Jan didn't find an opportunity to knock him out. I mean, I know Aljo is tough, and he was trying to continue this high volume fight, but he was, I mean, the openings were coming more and more, and they were bigger and bigger and bigger in that fourth round. Then, of course, the ending happens. And I think, I watched it back again, and I had kind of a different impression. When it first happened, it's not that I thought it was like intentional from Jan, where in terms of like, he's like, oh, I'm just going to be a dirty fighter in this moment. Why would he do that? Right. He knows that he's going to lose the fight that way. But you definitely see him check in with his corner. First of you hear the referee say grounded a second before, but that's when Aljo has his hand down. Then Aljo removes his hand, but he still has a knee, a foot, and his other foot on the canvas. And you see Jan look to his corner. They say something, and I know that this has been dissected ad nauseum. And then he goes ahead and lands the knee. So, and that was a position that they had been in many times before in the fight, like 3 or 4 times, where they were both kind of playing this middle game of Aljo would be laying down, trying to entangle his legs. Jan would be looking to land that nasty axe kick or whatever he was doing, thinking about getting back at Aljo's guard or just at least landing some damage as Aljo, was on his back, trying to invite him into his guard. So I think it was partly frustration from Jan, but I think it was also a bit of miscommunication. And then, when you talk about people's reaction to Aljamain being the champion, I was reminded when I watched the fight of his own reaction when it first happened. Forget all the social media stuff. Forget the interviews that he did afterwards. His immediate reaction was tears, and his immediate reaction was to throw the belt on the ground. So I think people who are criticizing him for holding the belt, taking pictures of the belt, are not, I don't know, they're not thinking about what it's like to go home to a party of people and have all your friends and family there. And you do walk in with the belt, because what are you going to do? Leave it at the gym, or leave it at the Apex? You walk in with the belt and your family's excited for you because in their minds, you're a UFC champion. You are a UFC champion. And most of them are not fighters. So they're not going to understand why you maybe don't want to celebrate this one. So I feel like Aljamain was put in a really difficult position immediately after the fight, where I think he had a lot of people telling him like, just, no, you're the champ, own it. And he is the champ, and he should be champ. And it's rightful that he's the champ. I think what happened afterwards was him probably leaning in a little bit too much, to knowing that people were going to give him a lot of shit about how he got the belt. And he decided, you know what, I'll just be a little bit of a heel, and I'll kind of like be self-deprecating and just own it and kind of almost make a joke out of it in some ways. You see him on the countdown. He's got his little, rule book for dummies or whatever. I think, unfortunately, it was just, I don't know, it's a bit of a misread on his part, and it hasn't endeared him to a lot of people. But as a result, this is an incredibly, incredibly important fight for him. And it has way more to do than with just maintaining and being the rightful, undisputed UFC champion. He has got to go out there and get people's respect back. And he can absolutely do that in this one fight, to erase everything that's happened over the past year, the way he won, having to pull out of the fight, kind of parading around with the belt the way that he did, and having that be distasteful to certain people. All of that can go away if he goes out there and he beats Petr Yan. And the more decisive it is, if he can get a finish, I mean, fresh slate. And I think that people need to recognize coming into this fight who Aljamain Sterling is, because it's easy to look at the first fight and say, well, Petr Yan was winning it handily. And he was. That's just, you can't say otherwise. He absolutely was winning the fight. But let's not forget, Aljamain Sterling is also the guy who beat Corey Sandhagen handily, who, by the way, Petr Yan had a really tough back and forth fight with. And I know we're not going to do MMA math, but I just did some MMA math for you. He's a nasty wrestler. He's got a phenomenal rear naked choke, and he's a very creative, unorthodox striker. It's a really good combination. And if he can get the cardio to support the type of game plan that he has, and on top of that, if he can have better decision making, more focus on efficiency in this fight and being effective rather than just being all over the place, we could potentially see a different outcome. That being said, Petr Yan looks pretty freaking good. The man is a scary individual, and I know I focused on a lot on Aljamain Sterling, but I think anytime you're trying to make the case that the fight could be different, which is the more interesting thing to talk about, of course I'm going to focus on Aljamain there, but it's going to be a good fight regardless. This whole card is crazy. Of course, we've got Hamzat versus Gilbert Burns. I won't even go into that one because I don't have the time to do it. It's going to be an incredible, incredible fight. His first real test. And I'm so excited to see that one. It's absolutely wild to me that the 3 top fights on this card are the ones with the biggest odds in favor of one particular fighter. That never happens in the UFC. I mean, sometimes you'll get some mismatching of odds lower down on the card, but the top 3 fights, there is a heavy favorite in each of those fights. So we will see if those results bear out or if we have some very interesting upsets. Regardless, it's going to be a phenomenal card. I'll see you guys in Jacksonville.